This is the Dean Obeidallah Show on SiriusXM Progress.
And welcome back, Dean Obeidallah Show. Right now, very happy to have on Dahlia Lithwick for the first time ever on the show. She writes about the courts for Slate, hosts the podcast Amicus, and is the author of the new best-selling New York Times book, Lady Justice, Women, Law, and the Battle to Save America. Plus, she's part of Mary Trump's Nerd Adventures. So, Dahlia, how are you? Nice to see you.
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Well, I've had Mary on many, many times. That's how I got to know her. I had her on for her first book, and we got to know each other. So it's great when I can join. Just life is so busy, it is hard to make the time because of the show. But first of all, congratulations on your book being a New York Times bestseller. That's fabulous. I want to start, though, with, I'm just curious, how did you become a legal a correspondent or journalist? Like, what attracted you to say, like, I like the law so much, I'm going to make it my life to write about it? Because I'm just intrigued, because I'm a former lawyer, and I never liked the law, so I didn't want to write about it. So what attracted you to it?
No, really, I was the most spectacularly terrible lawyer in the world. Like, I think, to be perfectly candid, I went to law school, I clerked for a federal appeals court judge. I did 2 years of, are you sitting down, family law in Reno, Nevada. And I would just be like sobbing because it was just so difficult and heartbreaking. And, you may remember Judge Richard Posner wrote this famous piece saying, maybe we should just flip a coin when we designate who gets custody in an ugly divorce. Like, it was so difficult. And I often say, I think if I was doing interesting, important, transcendently beautiful constitutional law, I would still be a lawyer. But because I was just sobbing in the court all the time, it meant that I got offered to cover the courts for Slate 22 years ago. And I was like, I would be an orthodontist right now. I would I would do anything. And so I kind of backed into it.
I love the law so much, I quit to become a comedian.
Exactly.
So that's how much it was really. You know what? I was jealous of the lawyers at my firm who loved being a lawyer. There were people who actually loved it. I'm like, wow, I wish I had that passion for this that I'm doing. And I did insurance defense law. So I was working at a big firm in Jersey, one of the biggest firms. And then I went to a mid-sized firm and represent big pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies, medical malpractice defense. Then more in the mid-sized firm, more auto insurance and a whole bunch of stuff. So you're just there fighting against people who were injured, or sometimes they exaggerate, I have to be honest, in their claims. And you're just fighting against them, and you feel at the end of the day like, I'm making a living, but I'm not making a difference. And to me, I wanted to do something to make a difference. And I thought comedy, that makes a difference. But if I was doing political comedy and trying to use it as activism, I really have. I was always doing comedy as activism, and my writing is, and this show, it puts it together. It's always about activism as part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so many people in probably our age cohort went to law school because they couldn't figure out how to go to med school. And it was like the other grad school that you go to, and that's not a good enough reason to go to law school. And there were, I have to say, huge numbers of people in my law school class who had been, Peace Corps people who had worked for campaign, who had done really interesting work, and then kind of got funneled into big law because of the debt and because of whatever the centrifugal force is that gets everybody to be at a big law firm. So I completely agree with you. I think the number of people who go to law school with this purposive, I want to do this, is so, the ratio is so off. And the number of people who go because they don't like seeing blood spatter is way, way, way right. Not representative of who should be at law school.
Well, I don't like blood, but I did want to be, I very much want to go to law school from a young age, because in my teens, when I got politically active and astute, because I wanted to run for office, and I noticed all these people in Congress all had a law degree. I'm like, well, that seems like a good thing. You're going to be a lawmaker. You should know the law. So that's why I went to law school. And I always thought I would practice law for a few years and then run for office and do public service, that kind of stuff going forward. And then a funny thing happened on the way to Congress, comedy. So that'll be my little book I'll write one day. If I could ever sell a book proposal to anybody, anyone wants to buy a book proposal, I got tons of them here. Although I just had my friend Andy Borowitz on last week, and he goes, you're so lucky they don't buy them. Because you know how hard it is to write these books? He goes, it's horrible. So I know we're going to tangent here, but.
No, I was just texting with Barb McQuaid, who is an amazing legal analyst. And
Yes,
I think
she
one
is.
of the smartest lawyers I know, and she just sold a proposal and said, "What's your advice?" And I just more or less said, writing is the most excruciating, painful, solitary, lonely, solipsistic. Every part of it is terrible. But then when you come up the other end and you have a book, it's pretty awesome. So you just have to kind of sacrifice years of profound misery for having done the thing that actually maybe makes you happy. It's not fun.
That's sort of what Andy Borowitz said. So let's talk about, you wrote an article you write for Slate. We're going to talk about your book, but I wanted to start with Slate and your article because there was an oral argument this week before the Supreme Court in the case Merrill versus Milligan, which deals with the Voting Rights Act. And once again, the GOP court, the extension of the RNC that charades as a court, has its eyes set on gutting this further. 2013 Shelby County case, they took a huge swipe away, the guts away from the court, from the law because of pre-clearance, which was so needed. The idea of pre-approval before you could change laws in these certain states that had a history of discrimination. Then last year in Bronovich, they weakened against Section 2, and now they're back. So could you share a little bit about this one? What's going on here, please?
Well, the most important thing that you just said is actually the thing that Elena Kagan said at oral argument, which is when you did Shelby County and you killed Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, you promised us we'd still have Section 2. And then in Brnovich, you took away Section 2, but you promised us it could still be used for vote dilution cases. Well, here's a vote dilution case. It's the only thing left to do with Section 2, which you've now completely eviscerated. Oh, and now you're telling us that it doesn't work for vote dilution cases. So just track the slipperiness of consistently saying, oh, you have a remedy somewhere else. Oh, you're going to have this other thing, as you slowly dismantle the entire remedy, because I think that's kind of the plan here. So the short version of Merrill is that this is a racial gerrymander in Alabama. And this is a state that has 27% of the population is Black. And yet the maps that were produced gave them majority control of only 1 of 7 seats. And for all the reasons that, going back to the Voting Rights Act, going back to the whole line of progeny of cases following that, petitioners wanted a second seat, and they could draw a map with a second seat because everyone else was packed into a jurisdiction where there was no possibility, if you were Black, of electing the representative of your choice. So this is known as cracking and packing in the world of gerrymandering, where you mash everybody into one district so they have only 1 seat, and then you make sure everybody is spread thinly among the other jurisdictions so they cannot possibly elect somebody of their choosing. And Alabama loses this case in a federal court with 2 Trump nominees who say this is a wildly unconstitutional racial gerrymander. And that should have been the end of it. But Alabama goes running to the Supreme Court, which does 2 things. First of all, last spring on the shadow docket, it says, oh, it's too late. Sorry, what can we do? So we're stuck with this map for the midterms. But then it says we're going to put this case on the docket and hear it the first week of October. And you're quite right. The claim that Alabama makes when they come in and they say there's nothing we can do, we can't change this map, it's totally fair, even though the vote dilution of Black votes is unconstitutional under any existing test. Elena Kagan calls this a slam dunk under current doctrine. And yet we have the Solicitor General of Alabama in there saying, hey, you know, the Constitution and the Voting Rights Act and the 14th Amendment, they have to be race blind. They can't take race into account for any purpose, including trying to remediate past voting rights harms. And you're exactly right, too, that the most amazing moment in the argument is Ketanji Brown Jackson. It's her 2nd day on the bench, first African-American woman in history. And she just starts reading from the reports around the framing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and says, how could this have been a race-blind project? This was done post-chattel slavery so that freed slaves could have rights. To suggest that this is a race-blind project or that it is somehow unconstitutional to take race into account is insane using text and history. Those are the tests that Federalist Society judges purport to hold above all. So she just read the text and she gave the history and said, please explain to me how it is possible that we cannot use the 14th Amendment to remediate centuries of racialized voting. Boom.
And yesterday we had Doug Jones on, the former senator from Alabama, who was known as her Sherpa, who helped then Judge, now Justice Jackson, navigate the whole Supreme Court hearings. And he went through it too firsthand from Alabama. And I want to play the clip, a little bit of Justice Jackson yesterday or Tuesday on this idea of looking at the history of the 14th Amendment and how anyone with a straight face can say the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment had nothing to do with race, and we're not going to look at race, when the 14th Amendment clearly was in response to Dred Scott, which said even free black people weren't citizens of this country. So 14th Amendment, one of the big parts, if you're born in America or a naturalized citizen, you have you're naturalized here, you get all the rights as a U.S. citizen, because they were saying before that if you were black and you were even born free, you couldn't be a citizen of the nation. So here's Justice Jackson, about a minute of it. Clip number 2, please, Aaron.
It became clear to me that the framers themselves adopted the Equal Protection Clause, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment in a race-conscious way, that they were, in fact, trying to ensure that people who had been discriminated against, the freedmen, during the Reconstruction period, were actually brought equal to everyone else in the society. So I looked at the report that was submitted by the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, which drafted the 14th Amendment, and that report says that the entire point of the amendment was to secure rights of the freed former slaves. The legislator who introduced that amendment said that, quote, unless the Constitution should restrain them, those states will all, I fear, keep up this discrimination and crush to death the hated freedmen. That's not a race-neutral or race-blind idea in terms of the remedy.
She laid it out there, and I just took a minute of it. It's longer, but I didn't want to play longer. But the essence of this, and the idea now that on the right, we are racist on our side because we're talking about race. They literally want to talk about constitutional amendments passed after the Civil War. These are 3 Civil War amendments, folks, 13, 14, 15. They were passed in response to us winning the Civil War. Not us, I wasn't here, but you know what I'm saying. The people who were here on the North that won, the good people, against the Confederate traitors in the South. And to say now we're not talking about race, and the same thing in Brnovich case, right? Oh no, we're not trying to discriminate against black or brown people. It's just they're Democratic voters, and we're trying to help the GOP. So I talked too long. Please go ahead, Dahlia. What did you think of there of Justice Jackson?
No, I mean, she was extraordinary, and we can have a conversation about what it means to substitute her for Justice Breyer. Because Justice Breyer, you know, I've been watching the court for 22 years, and he used to ask these like complicated 4-part hypotheticals that were like in the weeds on something. I mean, this is her just like taking a dagger right to the heart of the fight, and it's so powerful. And I think the other thing that I thought was really singular about this, and we just have to say it, for the first time in history, we're going to have this juggernaut, right? This 6-3 conservative supermajority. And the 3 dissenters, and let's be clear, they are going to be the dissenters, are women. One of them is black, one of them is a Latina, one of them is Jewish, and they are going to be on the losing side of every single consequential case that has to do with race and gender for the foreseeable future. And by that, I mean maybe 10 years. So it matters. It matters so much that this is being broadcast live, right? The court went back in person this week. They could have turned off the audio, but they've kept it on. Everybody could listen on C-SPAN. And every person who heard Ketanji Brown Jackson, the descendant of slaves on both sides, sitting there and saying, I actually went and read the reports. And for you to sit there and tell me that this is a race-neutral, race-blind proposition, or that it is racist to draw lines to remediate what is still, by the way, in Alabama, just shocking racial disparities around education, around redlining and housing, around pay. I mean, everything in Alabama that they're trying to fix is still very much the product of slavery. And to say, oh wait, I just looked at the report and here's what they were trying to do, and here's why. All due respect to Chief Justice John Roberts, who famously wrote, the way to get beyond racism is to get beyond race. No, the way to get beyond racism is to fix it. And so I just cannot say enough how powerful it was to hear her say in that little soundbite, if you're going to talk about text and history, let me read you the text and the history.
And I'm chatting with Dahlia Lithwick from Slate, and also the author of a great book, bestseller, Lady Justice, Women, the Law, and the Battle to Save America, which we're going to talk about in a minute. You know, when Chief Justice Roberts upheld Trump's Muslim ban, the travel ban, and went through all the anti-Muslim stuff he said, but said that doesn't matter. Like, I'm like, you're not living in the real world. And then you go back to Shelby County, same thing. They're living in a world that they either want to believe exists or they don't care what's going on in the real world, because for them, keeping power, if it's based on race or whatever it might be, I don't know what's in his head, is more important. Because it was jaw-dropping. I remember reading the travel ban case, which we knew in my community as the Muslim ban case. Trump ran on his primary thing. A total complete shutdown on Muslims coming into America, and the crowd went crazy. And this was day one, and he was doing so. It wasn't a total ban, but it came from animus. We know it was turning bigotry into policy of the United States of America, and they upheld it. To me, was despicable. And look, our history, there was something. So let's get to your book, because it's a perfect segue into here. And the book, again, is Lady Justice, Women, the Law, and the Battle to Save America. And you write in the book that the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe represents the end of a constitutionally protected right to terminate a pregnancy, the first major precedent overturned in order to deny freedom rather than to expand it. And that is so important. Can you expand on that a little bit? The idea of how our court, has a checkered past. It has Plessy versus Ferguson, but then you have Brown. You have Dred Scott, but then you have other cases going the other way. You have Loving versus Virginia, and before that you did have a case that upheld the laws that made it a crime for black and white people to get married. But we kept moving forward, and this court, for the first time, went backwards.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. You know, Obergefell overturned, right? It's every time the court overturns a case, including, kind of quasi-overturning Korematsu, the Japanese detention case, they say, we screwed up, we're embarrassed, we are going to do away with that, because the famous language in Obergefell, Justice Kennedy, when he said, of course we were wrong about same-sex marriage and LGBTQ rights. And then he had this gorgeous line, the times can blind us. But later we realized we were wrong, right? And that has been the history of like a more expansive and capacious notion of equal rights and of dignity. And to get to Dobbs and to have the court say that it was wrong to do Roe and that Casey was wrong. And by the way, to have Clarence saying, while you're at it, Obergefell is wrong on marriage equality. While you're at it, Griswold versus Connecticut, which conferred the right for married people to use birth control in their marriage, also on the chopping block. Like, be very aware of what it is that the project is here. It is not to confer more rights. It is not to have a more expansive view of what a pluralistic and tolerant democracy is. It is to do, and I know you and I have talked about this on Mary's show, this quasi-theocratic determination that something that looks like fetal personhood or the rights of the unborn is going to trump the rights of women. And that is, as you say, it's the first time in the history that the court said we were wrong about something that made women free and that made them equal, autonomous, participating agents in a democracy. And the last thing I'll say about it is that the thing that the court did in order to get Dobbs is exactly the thing we just talked about with Justice Jackson, which is completely ignore the text and history of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and the ways in which the 14th Amendment, with a laser view of giving rights to former slaves, said, you know what we are going to give you? We are going to give you the right to decide who you marry. We are not going to let people rape women and use their offspring as economic units. We are not going to separate husbands and wives. We are not taking children away from people and saying they have to go work because they are principally an economic entity. All of that was in the reports. All of that is in the debates around the 14th Amendment. And the reason that we give people bodily autonomy, family integrity, all the good stuff that gave us, as you said, Loving versus Virginia, that gave us Griswold versus Connecticut, it's not made up of nothing, as Alito would suggest. If you actually look at where those rights came from, they came from conferring actual freedom and dignity and equality on freed slaves. So to just ignore the actual text, to ignore the actual history and say the word abortion isn't in the Constitution is the exact same slip and slide that you're seeing in the Alabama voting rights case.
It's remarkable when you hear Republican lawmakers, Senator Blackburn and others, tell me where the word abortion is in the Constitution. Right. Why would it be in the Constitution? Like, first of all, why would you have the word abortion in the Constitution? You know, there are a lot of things not in the Constitution. Literally, I think that's why we have the 10th Amendment. Isn't the 10th Amendment the one that, or is it 9th Amendment, the one that rights that are not enumerated?
The reserves rights, yeah.
Right, that's the one. Elie Mystal talked about it in his book a lot, and I'm buddies with Elie, so we've talked about that. And I'm like, Elie, I'm so glad you put a whole chapter in your book on that. That's such an important one, because even Scalia is like, I don't even care about the 9th Amendment. Of course you don't, because it expands the rights that weren't put in by the framers. But so in your book, though, so I want people to, even though it's a bestseller now, and before we came on here, you're like, you can't even buy it right now. You can order it, folks. It is truly a profile, though, of extraordinary women. Some women people know, and many you don't know. I mean, some like Stacey Abrams you know, and Sally Yates. But other are women who are superheroes in their own right, but just not known for their work. Why did you want to, and then you wrote this, obviously, way before Dobbs, and Roe was overturned by the Dobbs case. But the beginning and end of the book does deal with the issue of reproductive freedom and arguments before the Supreme Court on that very point.
I wrote this book, I think, originally, to be candid, Dean, thinking it was a history. I wanted to just get on the record that the Donald Trump administration was the losingest administration in presidential history. They lost all the time. And, presidents usually win. And they lost because they were sloppy and careless, and they didn't follow the Administrative Procedures Act. And like you said, they did a stupid Muslim ban that, had to be reworked 3 times until the court would bless it because they were sloppy and careless, right? So I wanted to kind of tell the story of amazing women lawyers who, with this instrument of the law, beat back the worst forms of homophobia and racism and misogyny, because it was important to say, these are the ways we won. And then you're quite right. Then January 6th happens, and then an election denialism happens. And, you and I have talked before about, the subversion of future elections and Moore v. Harper, the case that's coming to the court, and the ways in which, the election system itself is on the hook. So then the book went from being kind of history to a blueprint of the different ways that we can use the instrumentalities of the law to fight back. And I think, I want to be really clear, Dobbs was a body blow, and Bruen, the gun case, was a body blow. Right now in New York, we just had a judge essentially say, okay, guns in the subway, guns everywhere. You should be able to have guns at domestic violence shelters. So I don't want to soft pedal how bad the court is right now. But I think that this book is, in some sense, and I want to say it's a blueprint, but it's very pink, so I guess it's a pink print. But I want to say that this is a kind of playbook for jumping into these legal fights, using the law and using the principles of the rule of law to get change and to fix things. Because I know you and I have also said this before on Mary's show, I just think if the rule of law collapses, and we're there, right? We're right on the precipice. That's Eileen Cannon. That is, this lawless decision in New York around guns. We have no plan B. There's not a better thing. There's just street fighting and violence. And so I'm a big believer.
Those aren't good options.
Not good options. I'm a big believer. And who's going to really, really not win in street fighting and violence is women. So I want to sort of make the argument that we have this amazing toolkit. And one of the chapters in here is about the Nazis and the white supremacists who marched in Charlottesville, and how Robbie Kaplan and Karen Dunn dust off the KKK Act, and they deploy it to bring justice to the white supremacists who marched in Charlottesville. So there are tools at our disposal. And I know you and I started by talking about hating law school and the law, but there are legal tools that can be used, I think, to vindicate rights and to make us equal. And so I wanted to sort of lift up some of these women, some of whom are obscure and unknown, to sort of say, this is how we do it, because I don't know what we do if we don't have law.
It is still, despite where we are, an inspirational book to see these remarkable women do extraordinary things. And again, many we don't know, like Becca Heller I didn't know about, but what a great job. And it was dealing with the Muslim ban, the airports. I'm like, wow, remarkable. There are a few things, though. By the way, the rule of law is coming back because Hunter Biden's about to get indicted. So that's going to return everything. We're fine then. We got Hunter goes to jail. The rule of law. In the book, though, there are a couple of things I want to ask you about here. One is you wrote something I didn't think about, that the chant of lock her up, echoes of savagery, vigilantism, and abuse. Tell me, and that was obviously the chant at the Trump rallies, lock her up, about Hillary Clinton. And now we're seeing with women, while the laws yet don't call for locking women up, literally it does figuratively, and ultimately they will go to prosecuting women because the laws, there was a law in Arizona in their territory, the one that just got reinstated from 1864. Well, there was a companion law that was repealed a few years ago, but that put women in prison for having abortions. They have to go there. They have to if they're going to commit to this. So why did lock her up echo this savagery and abuse when you heard that?
I think because, and it goes to, I think, a theme that threads through the whole book, which is we have really taken for granted that law is the thing that saves us, right? It got us credit cards in the 70s. It got us the vote. It got us, the right to say my husband cannot rape me in my marriage. It's still rape, right? And so I think we go on screen save. And by we, I mean a lot of American women who are just like, cool, the law is our friend. And I think there's a counter narrative here, which starts, as you say, lock her up when it's chanted at Hillary Clinton at Trump rallies. It seems like, oh, this is a metaphor, right? Until you realize Donald Trump is actually saying, no, I'm going to get my attorney general to investigate you. And Donald Trump is saying, before he took it back, women who get abortions should be punished. And then it's not just lock her up directed at Hillary Clinton and her emails. Then they're chanting it about AOC. Then they're chanting it about Nancy Pelosi. They were chanting it about Christine Blasey Ford. And so I want to be really clear that I think this is not a metaphor. This is exactly how historically troublesome, meddling, witchy women were dealt with. They were locked up, right? And then you fast forward, because it's not, in fact, the case that it's not already happening. There are women sitting in jail in Alabama who cannot get out of jail on bail because the state thinks they are endangering their pregnancies. And they are, by every other metric, they should be allowed out. But the state has determined that because of drug use or other fetal endangerment, they will sit in jail. Brittany Pula is sitting in jail in Oklahoma because the state determined that she caused an abortion by the use of drugs. And so women are, in fact, going to go to jail. It's not a far distant future. And I think we have to be really aware that there's a straight line between those 2 points. There's a straight line between Justice Alito citing a person in the Dobbs opinion who was a witch burner, who was a judge, Sir Matthew Hale, who was all for witch burning, and getting to this point today where women will go to jail for fetal endangerment. They will go to jail for miscarriages that the state investigates and determines weren't really miscarriages. And so I guess I just want to lift up the idea that that's like really in our muscle memory, that the law is both a source of like great freedom and benefit and equality, but it has been used historically for centuries, for millennia, to punish women. And that we have to live on that theme and push in the right direction.
It's remarkable history of women in this country if you go through and understand it the way you do, like the fight for the right to vote, how it started like in upstate New York, a long time before we get to finally get that chance. And I can't remember the name of the town in upstate New York right now. It escapes me, but I was just reading a book about it. And in any event, so Dahlia knows everything. So she's looking around. It's probably on her wall somewhere.
No, it's on the tip of my, just give me a second. We'll get there.
Famous.
Yes.
All right, it'll come back to us. But in any event, like Susan B. Anthony and all the women, they're there. In any event. So, I read yesterday from the New Testament for people from Timothy. It's in the New Testament. And it talks about a woman should learn in silence. She shall not teach a man. And it goes on to say, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, or I pull it up exactly, but it goes on to say, and the reason is because Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived, and she was the deceiver, and that she can cleanse herself of this by giving birth to children. And people go like, well, why are you cherry picking from the Bible? Because you don't like when they cherry pick from the Quran. I agree, I don't. But of evangelicals, they take the Bible literally, and some of them really believe this stuff. So you've got a situation where the woman, look at the response to Herschel Walker. If Herschel Walker was a woman who had an abortion, I think the reaction is different than he's the guy who paid for the abortion. And it's the idea the man can do that. And of course they're hypocrites, but I really think there's a difference between a man paying for it to them, because the men can do that, they're the leaders, And as I mentioned to you, breaking news in the New York Times a short time before he came on air said they spoke to the woman. They're not going to reveal her name, but they spoke to the woman. She had a second abortion. She almost had a second abortion. She didn't. And what he said to her, Herschel Walker, and this is the quote, and I want to read it for you. I want to get this right here, is that he said he told her that it was just not a good time for a baby. In quotes, not a good time for a baby. So she had the first abortion. And the second one, she didn't abort. She gave birth to it, and that's why they broke up. And Trump, and I said Trump, that was Freudian. Walker going, I don't know who she is. Well, New York Times shows now he's been paying child support, court-ordered child support for the kid. So of course he knows who the woman is. But this idea that it's not a good time is okay for Herschel Walker because he's a man. And I think it's deeper. I think that's what you're getting at. Please share a little on this.
Okay, first of all, Seneca Falls, New York, 1860.
Seneca Falls, that's it.
Boom.
Bingo. All right.
There you go.
Thank you.
And it turns out that Google works. But I think that it was driving me crazy. I think that the point you're making is so deep, and we just need to really kind of excavate what you just said, because the idea that a man can get an abortion exception because it's not convenient, right? And we saw people laying hands on him and praying for him and talking about Satan, right? Democrats are Satan who are out to get him. And he gets that choice because it's inconvenient or because he repents later and says, oh, now I have found God and so it's okay. And that women can't get an abortion when they're septic and bleeding out. And the doctor says, I just read this horrifying piece in the 19th saying that there are doctors who say she's not dying enough for me to treat her. Like that's what a doctor now has to try to manage, is a whole team of lawyers. And whether you're dying enough to get methotrexate for your cancer, to get, pain meds in Arizona. So I just think that what you're pointing out is so essential, which is who has full agency here? Herschel Walker, because he's rich and because he's famous and because he changed his mind or it wasn't a good time or because later on in life he came to regret it. So he is a fully realized moral agent and he gets exceptions. And by the way, if you're a senator who voted, who goes ahead and votes for personhood, if it's your mistress, she also will get an exception, right? If it's your daughter, she will be able to fly across the country and get an exception. Who doesn't get an exception? Women who are poor, who are black and brown, who are in states like Oklahoma and Tennessee and Mississippi, they don't have agency. And so the thing that you're saying is, and I think this is so true, from the founding, the Constitution treated women like they were either property or children. And Herschel Walker and his ilk are treating the women as though they're still property and children. And he is a fully realized moral actor who has the ability to make a bad decision and change his mind and find God, or has the ability to pay for something and send a cute card that says, hope you're feeling better, or has the ability to say, it's not a good time for me. And as long as we think that women are babies or objects, and that men are the only people who move through life with agency and moral decision-making power, you're just going to be in this loop. And it's so important. I will just say this because you were talking about the Bible and the Quran. The most interesting thing I discovered last term, at the end of the term, is in that case about Coach Kennedy. You remember the guy who wanted to pray on the 50-yard line?
Sure.
And who the court, when they conferred upon him the right to pray at a student event with high schoolers kneeling around him and movie cameras everywhere, making sure that everybody saw it. And the word that the court keeps using is privacy. This is a private prayer. This is an intimate, private prayer between a man and his God. And that's the same court that in Dobbs doesn't think privacy attaches to a woman at all. So look who gets to move through life and claim privacy. And look who gets to move through life and be treated as though their body belongs to someone else.
And I so appreciate that because I think it is so much deeper. And I think that some of the discussion kind of misses that. And just your sincerity and what I can hear underlying it, the emotion in this, made me talk about this other issue too, because I think it is far deeper. And I think it's not the perfect setting for a cable news 4-minute segment, but in the bigger picture of life, this is what we're dealing with. And I mentioned yesterday, Congressman Jody Hice. He's a Democratic member of Congress, I'm a Republican member of Congress in Georgia right now. He used to be a minister. He's like in his late 40s, 50. They asked him, should can women run for office? And he said, as long as they have the permission of their husband. This is a guy who was in Congress, folks. Now, he said that before he was elected, but he said that just a few years before he was elected. And he was the guy that Trump put up to run against Brad Raffensperger for Secretary of State, and he lost. But the point is that Jody Heiss is not the exception. Of that school, of that extreme right-wing school of thought, he's probably mainstream. And he probably doesn't see anything wrong with that. Well, the husband says yes. Of course you could run. Why shouldn't you be able to run? Not even getting to the point that a woman should be able to make a decision. That's why when you can ban abortion, say at 6 weeks a woman can't get an abortion and she's forced to carry a fetus, even if she dies, you're saying something the size of a grain of rice, which a fetus is at 6 weeks, is more important than a fully developed human being. And that is so much deeper. We are dealing with something that it's about oppression. It's oppression of the worst type. And maybe Democrats don't want to talk about Christian nationalism. I know they don't want to talk about forcing religion. I have members of Congress on who, except for one, Susan Wild, who embraced it, and Fox News attacked her for it. She said, yes, this is about Christian nationalism, and they attacked her because she's Jewish for saying that, because they're just vile on Fox News. It's remarkable. So, all right, I mean, we kept you for a long time here, Dahlia. So last thing I'm chatting with Dahlia Lithwick and her new book, bestseller, Lady Justice, Women, the Law, The Battle to Save America. Near the end of the book, you say something. You write, we have a long way to go. The road will be bumpy. The destination still feels less than clear. And I like that because it wasn't this kind of bromide, like, it's all going to work out, folks. No, the destination is not clear. Yeah, it's going to be bumpy. I have no idea where this is going, any of this, what we're living through. I don't know if anyone's lived through these times like we have. I have no idea what it was like to be alive in 1859 America. But I don't know. Where do you think, and let's keep it towards the idea of equality for women. Where do you think it's going?
One of the things that I did in the book, and has really changed in my last few years, is really listen to Black women academics who've been writing about this stuff for years, for decades. Mm-hmm. And the book actually starts with Pauline Murray, who is somebody that nobody's heard of, who actually, by the way, clawed out of the rock face of the 14th Amendment, both what became the Brown versus Board of Education brief that Thurgood Marshall used, and clawed out of the rock face of the 14th Amendment the use of the 14th Amendment for gender equality that RBG ended up using, right? But everybody forgot Pauline Murray because Pauline Murray is a woman and Pauline Murray is Black. And today, Pauline Murray would also say gender nonconforming. And so I wanted to really think about Pauline Murray, Peggy Cooper Davis, Dorothy Roberts, Sherilyn Ifill, all of the women who've told me, if you were Black, you always stood in line for 7 hours to vote. If you were Black, you never had a right to abortion because the Hyde Amendment made it impossible. If you were Black, all the stuff that America is waking up to this last term, and it's like, wait, what? You're closing clinics? You didn't have a clinic in Tennessee. You didn't have easy funding for your abortion in Texas. And so one of the things that I've learned most, and it's why the book, sort of begins with Pauline Murray and ends on Stacey Abrams, is because I think a lot of Black women have told me over the last couple of years, if you're shocked, you are very privileged. And that this has been life if you were a Black woman, foster care for your kids and being told you're unfit and being, sterilized against your will in this country. So one of the things that I use to answer your question is that it has never been thus. And to pretend that it was thus for women is to look at a really tiny, very, very lucky cross-section of women who had all the benefits and privileges that you and I think just got taken away. And so I think my answer to the question is listen to Dorothy Roberts when she talks about criminalizing Black bodies. Listen to Michelle Goodwin when she talks about criminalizing pregnancy. That is, in fact, I think the future, unless we press really hard to forestall it. But also be very, very mindful of the fact that these women have been writing and thinking about this for decades. They just didn't make it into the con law books that you and I studied.
Well, my friend Dahlia, that's very well put, and I appreciate your time. Again, the book, Lady Justice, Women, the Law, and the Battle to Save America, is a New York Times bestseller, just out a few weeks. I highly recommend it. You'll learn about a lot of remarkable women who've done things that most of us don't know, and some of them we do know. But Dahlia, congratulations on the best-selling book. Thanks so much for being on. I appreciate you being on. I hope you'll come back on again.
Yeah, have me on something a little less grim, please. Let's do comedy next time, because this is
There is no comedy. We're in a time of grimness. Don't you understand how this works right now? After we have 32 days to the election, and maybe when the election's over, and if we hang on to things, we'll be all right. Well, thanks, Dahlia. Thanks. So have a great weekend.
Thank you, Dean.
Take care.